Fucking what episode this fucking thing sucks so much, God. So much fucking God. Why? Technology so shit. It's so bad. People in the future are like, dude, how did people put up with this shit? I mean, like, it's just. No one really knows for sure. Elo by Elo, Divrei Elohim. We live by. Berkata Adonai Eloheinu melech ha'olam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvot v'tzivanu al sefirat ha'omer. Blessed are you, Hashem, our God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us with his commandments and commanded us concerning the counting of the Omer. Today is days, which is 6 weeks and 6 days of the Omer. May the merciful one, Beit Leonard, 2 Menzela. May the merciful unto us service of the merciful restore unto us Mikdash to its place speedily in our days. Menzela. Are you fuck serious? Alright, folks. Think about Kabbalah Coffee. 3rd of Sivan, 5786, Tuesday, May 19th. Everything sucks. 3761, world birth of Adam and Eve. Chava, 3631, 130, Seth, son of Adam, was born. 3526, 235, Enosh, son of Seth, was born. 3436, 325, Kenan, son of Enosh, was born. 3366, 395, Mahalal, son of Kenan, was born. 3301, 460, Yared, son of Mahalal, was born. 3139, 622, Chanuk, son of Yared, was born. Shit sucks. For how many days have you been doing this? I'm Dr. Sledge, and welcome to Esoteric. We explored 100 and everything. So and religion. That, for instance, is really terrible through the ages and are still developing. There are now, and there have always been numerous schools of Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. Prophets of ancient Israel of modern in the 18th century. Of course, this series isn't meant to be exhaustive by any means, but only should serve as a springboard and hopefully will also enable you to situate developments in Jewish mysticism Kabbalah in their historical and cultural context, and hopefully embolden you to dive into the more admitted as sublime as they are obscure. Let me express my gratitude to the congregation for allowing me to
entirety of the start of the introduction. I'll be uploading them over the next few weeks, or if you find these episodes after autumn of 2021 and you want to watch the entire series, I consider supporting the production of free academic and scholarly topics in occultism, hermetic philosophy by joining my Patreon or perhaps with a one-time donation. You can find those links below, and I really appreciate your consideration. Now, let's enter the garden of Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. Folks, well, welcome back. Welcome back. We're going to get to, in some ways, the high watermark of the Kabbalah tonight. I say the high watermark because it's like Luria's formulation of Kabbalah has basically become Jewish theology. And that's something I think that we need to stick at that. It's a really incredible thing that fundamentally one God in many ways formulated how Jews all over the world that they live in. And it's a glorious version of the Kabbalah. It's so deeply embedded in Judaism. Phrases like Tikkun Olam, a phrase that I bet everybody in this class has heard a dozen times. Shuls have Tikkun Olam committees. So context really emerged from it. And so tonight we'll get to his ideas. Now we're not going to exhaustively deal with his ideas for a couple of reasons. The first reason is that most of his books aren't even translated into English. The vast majority are not translated in English. Even the books that remain in Hebrew are so difficult that I have to admit, often can read pages of these books and still not know quite what the world's going on. These books are very, very difficult, and part of how it's like Luria's Kabbalah developed was people trying to make sense of what in the world he was doing. And so part of what happens is that the books are very complicated, and that the complicated is spawned, so it has its own. So we'll talk about that a little bit again to Luria. But before the rise of Luria and Kabbalah, what we have is in that period, Kabbalah did not spread very quickly. It was a very underground, it was a very elite, it was a very hush-hush kind of thing. That's not to say that people weren't publishing things and talking about Kabbalistic ideas, but there was never a desire to make it public. It was a very hush-hush elite. And by 1492, with the Alhambra Decree, which basically all Muslims and Jews had to leave Spain, or you have the Kabbalah transforming from being a very elite, very inner, very inward-looking, very thing, to the Kabbalah becoming imbued with a very eschatological into the world and messing in things. And so, in the aftermath of the disaster that was 1492, Kabbalah is going to branch out into the world, it's going to become popularized. And many of the refugees who fled from Spain were actually saved by a Muslim leader. I don't know why that great guy or anything. He may have been that too. He realized that hug your country. Of course, he was the right to do it. There was a huge boom from the importation of refugees after the 1492 Alhambra Decree. By the way, you can also notice that Spain didn't do terrible. They're going to settle the Ottoman Empire. One of the main places they're going to settle is going to be Warsaw, has been traditionally known as one of the two Jewish cities in the world. And so Salonika and Greece are going to be one of the places they're going to settle. But many of the Kabbalistically inclined people are actually going to move to the places they're most familiar with, at least in their sort of imagining. And that's up in the Galilee at a place called Sfat near Meron, where Shimon Bar Yochai is the traditional author of the Zohar, was thought to be buried. And it's there at Meron at popularized. There's working on Kabbalah publicly at some level. There are classes that you take on Kabbalah. And what ends up happening is in this area, there is a rise of a new form of Kabbalah that is highly systematized, highly intellectualized, very encyclopedic, and very synthetic, which is just to say that it's organized list of ideas in that system of course, like just Vero, just a moment. Of course, other forms of Kabbalah also existed at this time. We talked at length last time about Abraham Abulafia and his so-called ecstatic prophetic Kabbalah. This is a completely other form of Kabbalah that doesn't really care much about the spheros and that kind of stuff. He knows about them and he's aware of them and he's interested in them, but that's not part of the parcel of his project. His project is kind of intellectual communion with the divine, and that's accomplished by words and various kinds of emotions. So there are forms of Kabbalah that came about in the view of the Zohar that didn't quite make it. Now, what's going to be really important is that in the Safed milieu, the setting that's going to basically say about him. Remember, he'd gotten basically educated and exiled from coming out and kind of dies. He's going to be kind of resurrected in many ways by Louis Kabbalah. And as I mentioned, this is the area in Safed where Kabbalah is being systematized and it's being popularized. I cannot stress that enough. Kabbalah is being taught in public. Why? Because they think the world's not going to end. They think that the 1492 Al-Hafra decree was the beginning of the alien of Kabbalah to the world, and ultimately to a kind of would be led at some level by Kabbalistic speculation. It would urge in the science. And in fact, there were many people at that time, Cordovero being one, Tall being another one, Gloria being another, that many people, including those people who thought they were the Messiah, Chaim Vital, which have diaries, he even says in his notes that, so these guys are really convinced that the Messiah is not just around the corner, but they might be it. And that kind of idea that you might be the Messiah and you might be engaged would be hugely important to get you when we get to chapter 3 and his mystical heresy that leads to people to believe he's the Messiah. So Shabbatai Tzvi is next week, and that's that. So, as I said, this is a time period where Kabbalah is popularized. It's a time period where Kabbalah is being opened up to the masses at some level. I'll say the masses is being opened up to really elite dudes. It's not being opened up to everybody. And there are new services invented. Kabbalah Shabbat, into a Jewish service, into a Frank Kabbalah Shabbat. That service being developed this time. And Shlomo Alphabet's writes the centerpiece of that text, that prayer service. Come, my beloved, come, my bride, and that was worth pointing out. Cordovero married Shlomo's daughter, so Cordovero or Alphabet as Cordovero. So you have all kinds of this intellectual thing there. And this is a very tight-knit world. I can always imagine some Kabbalist drama that must have precipitated in the circle of love of Kabbalist drama. But unfortunately, a lot of it doesn't survive. We just got a rough idea about what some of these texts look like. So this is part of Romine. This is the main text of Joseph Cordovero. This is the central text of the Cordovero system of Kabbalah. A rough idea about how it is about that long, right? So it doesn't have any commentary, by the way. It's a straight text. And if you want to get what this looks like in some pretty dense wall-to-wall text, right? You get a sense of what this looks like. So these texts are no joke. Pardes Romine is an incredibly difficult, incredibly challenging text to try to read, and there is no translation of this in I don't think it needs. There's no systematic translation. These texts, foundational texts in English. Even finding copies. This one example of early systematization of the sacred. You can find these texts are super difficult. Finding English translations that just don't exist. They just straightforwardly don't. So studying scripture, you want to get really deep into a couple of main texts that are made fundamentally in Hebrew. We'll talk about later as well. So, beginning century, not only are Jews and but Christians are. This is a strange turn of events, but it's pretty important in the development of Western Christian spirituality, especially esoteric spirituality. As you, I'm sure, by the 15th century movement in Italy, happening is that many of these old texts, they are underwriting an idea that is called the Ad Fontes revival, which is a source of the revival. And what you get is a massive translation project led by translator, for instance, Plato. Most Christians in the Middle Ages had basically fragments of him, Emmaus, and they have other documents. But most pieces of Plato have been read by medieval Christians, just didn't exist. And so you have an enormous influx of new, old ideas coming in from Greece in the 15th century. And there was an idea that was current at the time that primordial wisdom was somehow more reliable than what was going on in the Middle Ages. In fact, it's the Renaissance humanists that are going to refer to that time period before them as the Goths will destroy the Roman Empire, the Western will backwards, superstition there. And so there was a long idea of the Renaissance humanists that the Middle Ages basically was a mistake. And so what we need to do is go back to Latin and Greek writers and learn from the original sources, read just the original source. And so this Fontes approach also included a great deal of what's going on in writing as well. Because that fundamentally Christianity had emerged from Judaism, and that there was primordial wisdom. Christianity had is that what Kabbalah? Hermes, I guess that's in these sort of. So there was an idea that Kabbalah had secrets that observed backwards and everything. So the idea was the Jews have a Kabbalah, but the Jews really don't understand. And so these Christians really begin to turn their attention to the Kabbalah, and they begin to recruit non-Jews, that is to say, Jews who have converted to Christianity, are Jews who have amenable to this sort of humanistic project. And so we have converts like Lysias and Euphrates, and we also have Jews who are just kind of cool with folks like Yochanan and Melon. And what ends up happening is that many of the texts of Kabbalah slowly begin to be translated from Hebrew and Aramaic into Latin. And as those texts begin to get translated into Latin, Christians begin to see that, one, there's something really, really interesting and really captivating about the Kabbalah, and two, they begin to believe that the Kabbalah actually proves the truth of Christianity. And so they use it not just as a way of accessing primordial wisdom, but also part of what is sometimes referred to as the Latin polemical tradition, where Jewish texts are marshaled against Jews in the interest of converting them. And so the Kabbalah is actually all kinds of Trinitarian ideas. The basic structure is that underneath the hood of Kabbalah, kind of mystical Christianity, the Jews just can't see it. What ends up happening is a lot of these texts begin to be translated from Hebrew and Aramaic into Latin, and this begins to form a time period where some of these early Christian Kabbalists are combining ideas from Plato, ideas from the Hermetic world, the ideas from Hermes Trismegistus. They're beginning to combine ideas from Kabbalah. They're beginning to form synthetic new versions of Christianity that, as you can imagine, are pretty controversial. So Kabbalah becomes one of the admixtures by which a new kind of Christianity is beginning to emerge, a kind of esoteric Christianity begins to emerge in the 15th century. And some of the adopters of these are some pretty famous folks, at least in the history of mysticism or the history of the occult. These are going to be folks like Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, who's famous 900 Theses, challenged the Pope to basically debate him about these. And basically, Ficino thought that Pico had thought that he had fundamentally synthesized all knowledge, Kabbalah, Christianity, Pythagorean, everything. He thought he had systematized every form of knowledge into a coherent system of 900 theses, and that he basically said, I want to debate people about this, and I'll show you that I'm right. And his Kabbalistic theses are among some of the earliest examples of Christian Kabbalah, and they are at the pinnacle of the book. They come at the very, very end. There's some of the final theses in the 900 theses. He really, Kabbalah has really landed on some of these things in a way that no one else has. Francesco Giorgi also a systematic incorporator of, and they are some of the earliest analysis of Christianity using Kabbalah as just also integrated Kabbalah and his version of the Tree of Life, the Eighth Sign, has gone on to become the standard one in the Christian occult world, or the occult world more generally, when folks who exist in places like the Gold and Hermetic orders, often the form of the also an all-important scholar of the Hebrew and the Renaissance. They were Ficcio and they are Kabbalistica, systematic of Kabbalistic ideas, but also Kabbalistic texts translated into Hebrew. Many non-Jews whose first encounter with Kabbalah almost certainly going to be a translation of the Kabbalistica, and that our another version is Kabbalah that got to unveil Rosenroth, a bunch of these guys are Germans. The Germans were pretty interested in this. I mean, in fact, many people have made the argument that the Protestant Reformation has its origins in this kind of touch with Kabbalah. Kabbalah is sort of the bridge at some level away from Catholicism, the gravitational pull away from Catholicism at some level at a very early strata was Kabbalah. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that Martin Luther was terribly interested in Kabbalah. He wasn't. Whole different ball of wax. At any rate, Kabbalah is incredibly influential. Cornelius Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy is probably the standard text in the Renaissance on occult philosophy and magic. Virtually all magic practitioners who operate now in the West, let's say folks for whom magic is a part of their spiritual practice, almost certainly trace back at some level to Cornelius Agrippa. So his 3 books of occult philosophy are foundational, and Agrippa integrates Kabbalah into these things. So he really is to ideas in Kabbalah. What I want to point out is that the Christians are also interested in Kabbalah. I think I mentioned this maybe a couple times ago, that the first time that the Zohar was printed, it was printed in a single volume at Cremona at the behest of Christians. Christians wanted to print it. It wasn't Jews trying to get it printed. The Jewish version was printed in Mantua. But a year later, in 3 volumes, which is still Christian. I saw like for a couple $100,000. Very rare. Now to say Kabbalah isn't just affecting Jews, it's also deeply affecting Christians. Christians are also really interested in the development of Kabbalah, and what's going to end up happening is that will form a trajectory by which Christians will begin to interiorize a lot of Kabbalistic ideas, and that will at some level lay the foundation for what we sometimes call Western wrapped up in that entire project. And I bet if you circle or something, you'll see Hebrew written all around the periphery. A lot of it has to do with the influence of Kabbalah on Christianity's more esoteric, more occult side. Christian Kabbalah has its own life, and eventually comes to become a new form of Kabbalah called the Vedic Kabbalah, which is very influential in occult circles, primarily beginning in the 19th century. Let's go back to Safed, right? Let's go back to Safed. Safed's really the stage that we're stage where all this is playing out. So Moses then died, as all people do, and so his death in some way signals the end of one process, one cycle of Kabbalistic development. And I will say that you can, in some sense, divide Kabbalistic history into 2 big phases. The first phase is from the early Kabbalah and Sefer Zohar all the way to Cordovero. That's one section of Kabbalah. The rest of Kabbalah can be divided into everything after that. We are all living in the shadow of what comes next. And what comes next is Gloria. Gloria arrived actually at Safed from Jerusalem. Although he grew up primarily in Egypt. He arrived at Safed, according to legend at least, on the very day that Cordovero died, and allegedly he saw as the funeral train was making its way to the graveyard, which you can still go see Cordovero's tomb in Safed. I've seen it right there. You can make your way to Cordovero's tomb, and the funeral train allegedly, as Gloria said, he saw a pillar of fire rising in front of the funeral train. Now, for folks who know some Bible, you'll recognize that image immediately, right? That's how God appeared to the Israelites during the Exodus. That God appeared to the Israelites as a pillar of fire. Literally, that appeared before the funeral train of Cordovero as a pillar of fire, and Gloria set in Safed. Gloria's life prior to this whole couple years before he dies in Safed is actually relatively unremarkable. He is born in Jerusalem. His father dies when he's relatively young, and he's raised by his maternal uncle in Egypt. His father, his uncle, is actually relatively wealthy, pretty wealthy guy, and with a very high quality Jewish education. And in between Gloria of the and he becomes completely infatuated with it. In fact, so that big duty. He was supposed to become a business person. He just abandoned that. He just basically abandons his wife. And he just kind of lives most of his days meditating out in a hut near the Nile. And it's during those years, those 15 or some odd years of him meditating on the Nile in this hut that he had built himself, that he begins, it seems to he has kind of been heralded by Elijah with all kinds of legends have now grown up around Gloria. Before he was born, that Elijah the prophet. At any rate, he would make his way back to Jerusalem, and then he would eventually make his way to Safed, arriving, as I said, on the day of Cordovero's death. And he would spend a couple of years there, just a couple of years, probably 2 or 3 years, and he died before he turned 40. This is one of these guys that the flame that burns twice as bright on burn the original. Well, with Cordovero dead, many people, I think, did believe that Cordovero was a Messiah. It was a real disappointment that he died. There were he has something else coming. Cordovero, maybe kind of like Elijah for the coming Messiah. And the Luria fit into that perfectly. Luria began to teach Kabbalah basically every day. He had introductory level Kabbalah class. Come to Luria's Kabbalah. Circle was composed of several students we know of. And what's weird is that he seems to have taught different versions of things to different students. And people were allowed, some people were allowed others, some people got some of the systems, some people got others. And we can see this in the publications because, for instance, one of Luria's students, Israel Saru, who doesn't really get any credit for anything and no one always pays attention to him because of the fact that he's tall. But Israel Saru published of Chaim Vital works, or Isaac Luria's works rather, and popularized them. And so a big part going on with Isaac Luria is that Luria really wants Kabbalist ideas popularized. That's probably part of his sort of program. He believes in a very intense way that the Messiah is a hair's breadth away. If comes out there, usher in the Messianic immediately. The kind of Messianic fervor kind of proved to be a disaster here. So we'll get back to that. Messianic fervor is almost always kind of a disaster. At any rate, he began to build an inner core of people, and then he died. He died. He died like 2 years into being in Tzaddik. And so his death wasn't, he was always kind of sickly, so his death wasn't completely shocking. But after his death, his most important students would be students, at least historically, is going to be Chaim Vital. Interpretation of Isaac Luria. The Arizal himself, Isaac Luria basically wrote nothing. He wrote a couple of Aramaic poems. That's all for Shabbat. That's all he had. He didn't really write much. He taught, and his students sort of synthesized the things that he taught. It's a synthesized documents that we do. There's a long tradition of this kind of thing, right? The Buddha never wrote anything down. Jesus never wrote anything down. Muhammad couldn't read or write. There's a whole long tradition of people. Socrates famously never wrote anything. There's a whole long tradition of people who don't write things down and yet go on to change the world. So if you really want to change the world, don't write books. Writing books is a surefire way that you will not change the world. Charismatic leader and don't write anything. And if you talk to people and you're charismatic enough, they will do all the writing for you. And and again, it's like Glory was only there in Suffolk for 2 or 3 years, and he managed to make this kind of crisis through his student Chaim Vital. So, what do we know about the system of Lurianic Kabbalah? Well, I'm going to go ahead and tell you right now. I'm not going to go systematically go through every part of it. It is incredibly difficult and baroque in its detail. But the main thing to know about it is that whereas Cordovero was moving in a much more rationalistic, much more intellectualistic, much more systematic direction when it comes to trying to unpack the ideas of the Sefer Zohar, Luria is much more interested on the mythos of the Zohar. He's much more interested in the evolving process that the Zohar seems to describe about how God goes from being infinitely recessed to becoming present in the world. And so Luria's main shift is that he's going to shift away from systematically analyze every aspect of how reality was constructed, but rather focus on the unfolding, the dynamic unfolding of reality and the mythology of that unfolding. And it's the mythology. And I say mythology, I don't mean falseness or like the Loch Ness Monster is a myth, but it's the of it that really matters to him. Because for Luria, the entire drama of the unfolding or the evolution of reality as we know it isn't in the past, it's always present to us. And so in a way that the Cordovero might describe that the events of the unfolding of the universe via the Sephirot are events in the past, primordial past, the metaphysical past, for Luria, time is really weird. It's all happening at once. It's happened back then, it's now, at some level, it's happening in the future. and the future is kind of reaching for us to redeem us. And it's like time becomes very weird in the Lurianic system. So what we get is that he's primarily interested in what I might call the mythological structure, the genesis of reality, and its development, as that development is comprehensible at any given moment of humanity or not. For Luria, the development of God and the development of humanity are tied together. They're the same development, basically. His system, as far as we have it, is a really highly developed system of analyzing reality. I can't say that it's all coherent, and I certainly can't say I always understand it, but what he's focused on, what his core idea is what often gets called the order of evolution. This is often referred to as the Ser Ishtatlut, the order of evolution. In fact, the Ishtatlut is actually a standard modern Hebrew word for evolution, like many other people. So it's the evolution of reality. Now, just again, these evolutionary models are actually instructive, right? Because at some level, biological entities contain the past within inside them. That is to say that you contain all kinds of things in your DNA from what we used to be. We're not apes like the apes before us, but we contain DNA fragments of those apes. The past is still with us. Or as Bill Faulkner said, that the past isn't dead, it's not even past. And that's true also for Lurian and Kabbalah. The idea is, yes, there were things that happened in the primeval past, the primordial past, and those things are current to us now, which is still happening. And so what we get is that there is a spiraling cycle of aggression. The world is coming into being. The world is emerging as such, always emerging as such, and further right, so regressing. It's also going back to the way that it was. So there is incredible dynamism in the Lurianic system where you kind of don't know quite where you are in time and space. You don't quite know where you are even in righteousness. Sometimes there's a kind of a constant move and fro, where the world is on the one hand becoming exiled, and on the other hand is becoming redeemed. And so the Lurianic system, part of what makes it so difficult is that at the heart of the system is this dialectical structure where everything is happening all at once and everything is also being erased all at once. And so it's very difficult to figure out at what moment something is happening, because at every moment, everything's always happening. And so knowing exactly what's going on in the system is very exciting. The more you zoom in of the fractal, the more the entire fractal reproduces. The system is very, very flex like that. And so it's often difficult to know exactly. But let's go over some of the core ideas of this Luria. The big first idea is his concept of Simsum. Simsum actually. In fact, the problem is, well, how problem you get from an infinite is to whose light reaches every metaphysical ontological aspect. Be the case that God is completely in fullness when the system's full, and you can't have the world. So God has to create an emptiness, a divine emptiness, a vacuum. And what God does is God contracts some region of God's self. I use words like, but again, the spatial concept is not accurate. But God ontologically God's self contracts and creates a void. And that void is both surrounded by God and yet is not God. It's a kind of gap. It's a kind of void or a vacuum. I don't know. I always imagine like when you have to you gained a couple pounds and you need to get in some old pants, so you it's got on or something. I don't know how to. I didn't have. So God creates this void, and worlds that comprise our. You do not have access to God. You do not have access to God concentrates some of God's light, God finitizing, and that finitized light, that finitized existence of God is permitted to enter the void. It cascades into the void, and that cascading, as it moves from the primal source of the divine to the void, it begins to weaken, so to speak. And as it begins to weaken, as it titters down into the void, as it flows down into the void, it begins to weaken. And as it weakens, there are strategic parts, or the decisive parts in the weakening of the light. It is powerful. It only goes going to reach far, and the farther it gets, the wider it gets, and the more it begins to break down and begins to go away. God shoots that light, also found in the Zohar, and as that light goes in, it begins to break down. And as it breaks down into 4 distinct realms. And those 4 distinct realms are the fundamental structures of reality. The first one is Adam Kadmon. Adam Kadmon is the primeval body of God. It's the way that we imagine God to be. It's when you think of God as a person, what you're imagining is Adam of God as a being. Because it's just infinite light, God is utterly unimaginable. The first glimpse is Adam Kadmon, sort of like a negative image of God broadcast into the void. The next layer down is the realm of Atzilut, or emanation. Then down further is the world of Beriah, right, where God is becoming more and more concretized, not yet physical, but more and more concretized. And then we get to the world of formation, where God is recognizable. We get down to the world of Asiyah, and we are actually in a subsection of the world of Asiyah. So the 4 worlds, the Olamot, are the ontological registers of reality. And we imagine these 4 worlds is that every single time there is a movement within the Godhead, an evolution in the Godhead, change in the Godhead, that change has to be understood as a logical, dialectical progression of how God is mutating, how God is changing. Because every time God interacts with something, that image of the world registers of reality as we get entirely different branches of the spirit. Now, I might pull this up when we get to the Q&A later, is that one thing that makes the Lurianic systems mind-bogglingly complex is that every register reality has its own sephirotic structure. And inside every spherot is more spherot. And so there are spherot inside of spherot inside of spherot. There are spherot on the backside of Gevurah, which is the Sitra Achra, the world of evil. It is again, for folks who are familiar with some mathematics, it's like a fractal. That anytime you stand on the reality, over and over, enormously complex. We're all those really the very we can't go into the various levels of reality because we don't have time, but each one of them is distinct, and each one of them is a moment in the development of the Godhead. Now, for some folks who have some background in philosophy, folks who've had some background perhaps in Hegel, this is going to sound really familiar because if you ever the logic of the progression of Hegel actually commends Kabbalah as prefiguring his life. Now, I'm not sure if that's an indictment of Kabbalah or not, depending on what you think of Hegel, but Hegel's system of the unfolding of reality is deeply, deeply, deeply influenced by the Lurianic sort of folding out structure of reality. Now, as God's light begins to travel through the void, what ends up happening is that the very structures that emerge to hold God's light, the very moments of the divine, as the light gets further and further into the void, the very structures that are meant to hold the divine light, I don't know, it's like it's a moment where you feel yourself, you're holding on to something right, and you feel yourself just slipping off. There's a moment where you just let go. And that moment, the moment where the spheres, the actual vessel that hold God's light, because they've gotten so far away from the original source, they don't have enough energy, they don't have enough dynamism, they don't have enough of chizuk, they don't have enough strength to hold God's light, and they shatter. And that shattering, the shira, the shattering of the vessels, pulls in, they power the vessels right, and they shatter. It's like putting, folks ever seen this where you take a really cold glass vessel and pour really hot water into it, right? Or, I'm sure you've seen folks, right, throw hot water on a cold windshield, because people who don't know any better. But imagine, right, hot water being poured into an ice cold vessel. The ice cold vessel is the vacuum, the void, the steam zone, and when that shattering forms what are called shards. And these shards of the vessel, these shards are characterized by disharmony and disunity. They're broken aspects of the divine. They're aspects of the divine that are localized. It's like if you'd imagine taking a part of your own personality and breaking it off from you. So just imagine your curiosity, right, which is a trait, and broke off and made it its own thing. Pure curiosity is a disaster, because anything that's purely curious is going to get itself killed, it's going to hurt people, it's not going to have any ethics, it'll just experiment on people. And even love, right, pure love, if you take it away and put it with no checks at all, it's too much. Any aspect of the divine broken away from the divine and then given its own reality will always be too much, no matter what it is, whether it's God's wrath or God's goodness, whether it's God's curiosity or whatever. None of these things do things on their own. And the shards of these vessels.
I love this picture because it's a kind of illustrated. The father is watching one of the AIs and all climbing around and watch. And finally, close to the left, that really doesn't have what's happening up here. Sitting, that is just the last thing to drop. He's saying dollars. Other than the set course, it's much higher. Especially the compounds that we go. So that's great because a lot of people they find the set course kind of yes. Okay. So you set that nothing more. Players in place or things that so you're saying no, I was here's the say I don't work for I've been doing something, but I find this not great so we back to there. You get secondly, one of the great stars and downloads is really 100%, 1,000%, which are people that told me that they surround that many people showing again the whole world choose how it's very, very strong people that's in the north of, it's called making it practical. And in a nice way. The way you just, send out survey.
Vessels, according to one evil. But because they're localized, be allowed to. God's light in the entire process of the vessel. There is a very limit of that. So it's a very limited of that. Like a rubber band, right? If you rubber band out, let it go, it flies back. Again, for all of the scientists, we are the system that's to move back up. We are the part that moves back up. And what happens? We recognize, Florian Kabbalists recognize, that shards of the divine, the code, can be rectified by engaging in the magic of the Torah. Again, Yitzhak Luria is not sort of a misnomer. You repair the world, medically repair the world by engaging metaphysical act. Because the divine law, the Torah is the system. It's like the source code of all reality. It fixes reality. Reality is broken somehow. And so the fix is, according to Gloria, the very strict following of the Jewish law, of the Halakha, and of the Torah. So by following the Torah, you repair reality. And this is where the phrase comes from. You are repairing the world. Now, I know that most people do that, but for Yitzhak Luria, just a fixing the world in terms of the social ills or doing social justice stuff, that's of course one. But by having the right kavanah, by having the right concentration, by doing the Jewish law with an absolute intention of purity of heart, by performing things like Shabbat, putting the tefillin on, by observing the fast of Yom Kippur, or whatever, all of these things help to repair reality. Reality is a metaphysical level. Begin the learning system, the act of reparation, the act of repairing the world against the sort of build the world to merge. And at some level, you can imagine return the key. We will build the world worthy of Messiah, and Messiah will come and turn the key, and they will unfurl the final redemption. And so it's by repairing the world that we prepare the world for the possibility of Messiah. And this idea is going to have impact in history. I don't know if it's you can be walking around New York, I'm a black guy, like, on the street, and get it. I'm like, no. It's like, what's going on now? Why would they bother you on the street with what's going on? It's not because they're trying to do you a favor. They're trying to engage with the mom. They think that every Jew, whatever that means to them, who can engage in the process of the mom and put the felon on, or usher in the days of the Messiah, that was trying at some able to accelerate, right? Think about Kabbalistic ideas, or you accelerate that by engaging in spiritual warfare against the foe and by binding in a way that allows you to basically accelerate the process by which the Messiah comes. And if you read Chaim Vital, he really does think that he definitely thinks he's the Messiah. And he just thinks that he has to be a little bit more righteous. If he could just be a little more righteous, just didn't think about that woman when he was praying. He just didn't think that dirty thought. He just memorized a little bit more Mishnah. He would have been revealed as the Messiah. He would have emerged as the Messiah. This side you see, Chaim Vital sometimes manages to be both incredibly self-deprecating and also incredibly, I guess that tends to go hand in hand. But sometimes he's not worthy, I'm low, and it's like, yeah, if I've just done this, I'm the Messiah. So the idea is that the Messiah is right around the corner, and it's the result of this process. Now, of course, that idea has gotten retrofitted in sort of liberal Jewish circles for social justice, but in classical Kabbalistic world, it has everything to do with strict another is some of the more bizarre sections of the Zohar. There are three sections of the Zohar that are notoriously difficult to understand. Two of them are the assemblies, and the third is a section called Sifra Ditziyuta. And Sifra Ditziyuta is a relatively brief section of Zohar that contains the long description of God's beard. And then there's another section that also contains descriptions of God's beard, but also God's face in general. And no one's really sure what in the world's going on. They're weird, sort of weird enough, but it's like weird on weird. And Luria develops a systematization of this idea of the movements within the divine face. The divine face is actually reflective of metaphysical changes in reality, and that the divine face countenances the Partsufim, that these Partsufim are arrangements of the Sfirot, and those arrangements of the Sfirot are indicators of certain kinds of changes that develop within the divine. I will go ahead and say this, the Partsufim is without a doubt the most complicated part of the entire structure of Luria and Kabbalah, because it's arrangements of, it's analyzing the Sfirot in terms of how they're arranged, and how all the various systems relate to itself internally. Completely figure out. Like I know what the various configurations are. I know what the Ima and the or whatever. Like I know what the structures look like. But when you begin to analyze how they move and change in relationship to other mystical stuff in the RSL system, it just becomes a maze. It just becomes a maze. So I have a real track of what's going on in the development of Godhead. What's important to know is that for Luria, God is not a thing. God is a process. And God is changing all the time. And so when God tells to Moshe Rabbeinu, right, yeah, I'll be what I'll be. Luria takes that really seriously. Yeah, God is changing. God is a process. God is not a thing. God is a process. And that process is reality. And we are part of that process. And just like you get angry, so it's just like you get, compassionate, so does God. And that the change of God from angry to compassion, or the change from a normal state of affairs to being angry, that change in your emotions can be mapped. And so, God and changing God's emotional life can be mapped. And those mappings of God's emotional psychology or intellectual psychology are the parts of it. It's very complicated. It's part of inner psychology, inner divine psychology. It's really complicated. Also, famously, Isaac Luria is going to reintroduce the concept of reincarnation into Judaism. Reincarnation is an idea that never really took hold in most of the Abrahamic faith. Although there are tiny groups that have believed in it at some point, but most of the larger Abrahamic faiths have rejected reincarnation for various kinds of reasons. However, in Lurianic Kabbalah, reincarnation is completely acceptable. In fact, it's more consistent. In fact, sort of general idea, this is Chaim Vital's main major work its time. This is the most systematic account of philosophy. This is by Frank Tom, and this is the reincarnation by Frank Tom's teaching of its shard of the name. So introduced into Judaism and morals. And so he had to get all kinds of what are called tikkunim, reparations. So these reparations include everything from ascetic practices to things that are in the Bible, to ancient mystical practices. And so the idea is that no longer are you responsible for you being a good you. You have to make up for all the things that have happened prior. Responsible there. You're most apt to figure out how do you figure that out. You go to a mystic, Kabbalist, and the Kabbalist will tell you your soul root, all the bad things that you've done, and they will give you tikkunim and how to fix them. Tikkunim, anything from extra prayers to amulets to they're all kinds of tikkunim. Do you ever go to spas? Do you ever go to zealots? I've seen signs in Saped, where they will go and they will figure out your soul root. And they're alleged expert on how to do this. And they get your soul root, they will tell you that your soul root was Lamesh, and you have to they can descend or inherit descend tikkunim that you need to do, preparation you need to do to fix the sins of past lives. Reincarnation has entered into Judaism completely intact, and it is a completely viable way to think about your afterlife. It's not heterodox at all. It's very normative at this point, and so reincarnation, with the rise of Lurie and Kabbalah, is now basically normalized in a way that I don't think it is in Christianity and Islam. I think in Christianity and Islam, if you want to believe in reincarnation, you don't want to make a big deal of it. I think you can make a big deal of it if you're a Catholic, whatever, you're in trouble. Reincarnation is completely normalized. Completely normalized. Now I say it's normalized, but it's only normalized where you want to find out who your reincarnation is of. You do all the in your past life. Now you do also earn the past life, but you also earn the past. Various other regions of the soul. Again, you have 5 regions of your soul. Some other regions of your soul can actually survive death and become detached from the other regions. And those detached parts of your soul, if you committed a lot of sins in your life, they become addicted to those sins. And those that aspect of your soul that becomes addicted to those sins actually can roam around and want to continue committing sex life. This is especially true of sexual sin, but also the drunkenness and stuff. If you lecherous, drunken. If you become addicted to those things, when you die, your soul will become so polluted that it will become detached from your other soul, roam around. And what does it want to do? It wants to continue doing what it did, getting drunk and having sex. And so what it will do is it will try to attach itself to other people because you can't really get drunk and have sex if you're just a soul. So you got to get attached to someone else. And so when when your soul, an evil soul, attaches itself with the people, the word for to attach in Hebrew is daba, like the modern Hebrew glue, from the same root word. Your soul daba, it clings to other people, and that soul that clings to other people possesses them. This is the origin of the Divik. The Divik is the evil version of your soul, it's the evil aspect of your soul that roams around and tries to attack people. And the very earliest exorcisms are actually from Sacrament. In fact, you taught a whole class on spirit possession in Judaism. And if you want to learn more about this, I have some episodes on my YouTube channel as well. But what you have here is demonic possession. Demonic possession is not the right word. It's not a demon. It's actually an evil, dead person possessing. And so Tabuk becomes a big deal in the Kabbalistic world as well. But the opposite is true too. The soul of very righteous people hangs around near their grave. And if you need to spiritual chizuk, some righteousness, let's say that you're somewhere and you know that your old paramour is going to be there, hook up with them. This is a real, by the way. You want to hook up with them, be married, whatever. So what do? You go into the graveyard of a righteous person, the graveyard on their soul. And impregnate you. And the soul, emperor soul, with a little, and you go to face the spiritual challenge of committing adultery, because your failure. Whatever your sin, it sounds like there are people who are enlightened in Buddhist tradition, they become so enlightened, they don't become completely enlightened, so they can stick around here to help the rest of us. It's the bodhisattvas. They don't leave, they don't go to Nirvana, they stay here to help the rest of us get a little bit more enlightened. Sadaki is a righteous people. You can go to their grave, and you can get a little bit of spiritual power from their soul, go into your soul and help. People do this today. It's a problem, actually, that people get caught sneaking into your graveyard and lying on graves to get soul power. Cool 70s. So, at any rate, so this idea of people are the idea. So, Tibuk, right, is evil souls becoming attached to your body. They can be an animal. It's like not good in there, but they and kind of be taught by tradition. By the way, he failed. He also did the Dibuk to leave, and then as soon as the Dibuk left, come back and repossess the person and kill them. And so there's all kinds of great Dibuk stories. If you've ever seen the movie The Dibuk, it's one of the great classics of Yiddish film. It was filmed in the 30s. In fact, many people that were in the film died in the Holocaust. And so it's really, I think they remastered it, they redone the Yiddish subtitles, and if you've ever seen The Dibuk, it's a great film from the 30s. It's a classic example of Yiddish theater and especially Yiddish filmmaking. Probably the crowning achievement before it all went to hell and Holocaust. But The Dibuk is a classic movie. We're getting close to Halloween time. It's also Jewish Halloween movie watching. So the Dibuk is an idea that emerges also in Kabbalah, but also as I said a minute ago, learning Kabbalah becomes just Kabbalah. If you've ever studied Kabbalah, you've heard this term, right? You've heard of the world of Atzilut, the world of Asiya. You know that the soul has, the Yechida and Neshama and Ruach and all the various parts of the soul. Lurianic Kabbalah just became Kabbalah. It absorbed all other previous forms of Kabbalah, whether it's Abraham Malachia's Kabbalah, whether it's Veril's Kabbalah, whether it's other forms of Kabbalah, it absorbed them all, and it transcended them all. It abolished them all, and it ascended And by both eliminating all of them and then and that's true of Hasidic people. That's true of Messianic people, components of also hardcore Kabbalah, Lurian Kabbalah is part of our theological landscape. Judaism, why isn't the Jews can't go by parts from the English? Why is it that not translated? There's a reason for that. And we'll get to that in a few weeks. There is how liberal Judaism decanonized Kabbalah. It rejected it. And that's part of what liberal modern Judaism is, the amputation of Kabbalah from Judaism. Now that's changing, but it's not changing in the right way. Because the way that it's changing is not. It's changing in the sense that it's being imported. They're being imported haphazardly. And the original texts are not being consulted. And they're not being really translated, and so those who are interested in Kabbalah don't have access to the original text. That's a disaster. It's a real disaster. I mean, if I don't know, if the works of Thomas Aquinas just weren't translated in English, you had to rely on old Latin editions and stuff like that. Would be a mess. Well, that's what basically we have. It's as if Thomas Aquinas had the influence he did in the Catholic world, and no Catholics have access to his actual works and a reliable future. It's a mess. It's a real mess. So it's a standard volume of Chaim in Hebrew. There's no English translation. There's no translation. We'll talk about why. It's a mess. It's a bad situation. So at the end of the day, it's like Gloria's version of Kabbalah. It went. Now I'm not saying it's completely systematic, but I'm not saying it's completely all worked out. There's a bunch of kinks in the system. It's a 15 collected works of some level of our results. That becomes Jewish theology. Now, on the one hand, that's really cool because Kabbalah formed. On the other hand, that's just we're interested in Kabbalah and these products have no access to it. It's a mess. I don't know how it's going to get solved, but it's just now in the past 10 years that it's translated reliably. So it's a big problem. We'll talk about why we're in this, but we may just take out 6 years after Chaim Vital died, the greatest articulator of the Lurian system of Kabbalah. 6 years after he died, a guy born in Asia Minor, in Turkey, Izmir. He's born on he's born on Tish B'Av. He's born on Tish B'Av, which happens to fall on Shabbat here. And there's a long-standing that the Messiah will be born on the Sabbath. That the day of the year that we're born, every bad thing that's ever happened to us, the great hope is that on that day, the Messiah will be born. That in the future, Tish B'Av will no longer be a sad day. It will be a glorious day. That'll be the birthday of the Messiah. On Saturday of Tish B'Av, 6 years after the death of Chaim Vital, Shabbatai Tzvi is born. And Shabbatai Tzvi is going to transform Kabbalah because he's going to be the Messiah. And not just the Jews were convinced he was the Messiah. He convinced the world's Jews that he was the Messiah via his publicist, Nathan of Gaza, using Kabbalah. and he will become enormously influential. In fact, in many ways, you can think about Judaism as a religion. In some ways, as before Shabbatai Tzvi, after. And Shabbatai Tzvi is going to transform Judaism. He's going to transform so much of what's going to happen. And so what we're going to do is he's going to basically shake Judaism to its core. Because as you believe that he's the Messiah, them literally have bags packed on the docks in Amsterdam, ready to go back home to Israel to live the Messianic age in the 66 first month. It's a Titanic disaster. Disaster. I mean, prior to the Holocaust, there's been no greater disaster than Shabbatai Tzvi episode. No greater disaster. And from a theological point of view, it's a disaster. So, in many ways, right, you can think about Shabbatai Tzvi is full current. And I imagine most folks here heard the ideas, I'm sure. Well, notice that it's died before he was clearly studying Kabbalah for his 40s. Where do ideas like that come from? They come in the aftermath. It's so they can see the entire Jewish world into a disaster. And that disaster, Kabbalistic disaster, will be heralded as Shabbatai Tzvi, false Messiah. We will turn to him and his arguments for his Messiah. And also Frankism. Frankism is a derivative of mystical heresy. It's kind of gone off the totally off. So we will deal with Shabbat. So cold. Welcome back, and thank you for joining me as I explore the garden that is Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. Again, if you'd like to support my work and provide accessible, free, and scholarly content on topics like Kabbalah, alchemy, and the occult, magic, and hermetic philosophy, consider supporting my work on Patreon or perhaps with a one-time donation. You can find those links below. Until next time, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and thank you for watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion.
Something else that you want to be is not the religion. Religion on my shoes, right? Doesn't matter what he says. And you say that it's a concept, which is always subtle. It's supposed to be correct. I don't have to say that oil is always and how is supposed to be so it's not on sorry since the context that's the but that people context is so it's not saying that we can here is not what is already there is a context other than that it seems like from the source of that there is a possibility of start. You continue. It's about all the things happen. So that was hard. Push let's get safe. Unless they change it, they don't have the direction. Cut it off. True, an original sheep was this. They're very, very large players. That's considered like the fattest part of the sheep, very, very close. So this keeps that's great. Sheep, spot the sheep.
Can you hear me?
So I want to show you before. I like this one. She got it so passionate about it. I thought I just really made it. I was trying to lay off. Okay. It's already so you'll just need to be like that. I have a little collar on the rash. If a person says he's going to refrain from drinking wine, rolls here, not even coming nice, for 30 days, and during those 30 days, he touched their hands. So he has to bring his Hashem himself. Another, sorry, that's not. Hashem himself is a person who has Shiraz, is really part of himself. Not. Now, these are younger. These are killer. That's what it's called Pesa. There's also Hashem. That is a zero. Or bad about the street shops. It's a good place. It says this should be expensive. Mostly on the desert. Shopping dealers. And if somebody they shot running back. Realize how old they are. Oh yeah, this is a 3-year-old. You know, we're not such one. And she, French here, they go so beautiful get out of she. Not something that they use. Maybe she, even the sheep themselves sometimes think it's funny. Josh is still there, just smoking around, throwing it down with something.
Who you fucking?
Great. He says, Gemara. Another guy can change and get in front of the next. So then you have a 1-year-old that looks like Benstein, he wants to do a channel. I was 10 years old and he put me in high school. When I was like 9 years old, he was very small. And he figured, I don't realize that I'm a mitzvah calling things. Like I didn't have to fill in because the word rap says word yesterday. So the guy that sent me that beautiful name about our last hour, he sent this fucking for a cheap rap. I was very upset about the rap. So, listen, you should do it. I go about it. Some kids look older than they are. Like, you know, I know in Israel, when you try to catch store owners selling minors, they always do like a 7-year-old, but it's like this 26. And they send it in, and then they store for owners, he doesn't ask for ID. He says, look, it's coming up. So he said, he can do which fine. So you never know. 2-year-old from the point. 2-year-old, it's not something that people really, as a side note, but our young people And this is now for young people and older. So both of those things are not the best. Like when a young person thinks that he's over and I'm shocked, but I was just discussing the other day and I said it in cheer. It shocked me. I met an older fellow, he was in his 60s, and he wasn't very healthy. And he was speaking as if he's, 15, 20 years old. And he has tremendous life. So, what is you gotta be realistic. You don't live forever. It's obvious that you didn't bring in his option. So you wanna know? I mean, maybe it's a sheep, it's black. Interesting. In other words, it's not a goat. People don't realize it's a goat. I think that maybe the sheep got a haircut, says Rashi. And therefore it's black. So it's a sheep. Well, what's that? What do you think the sheep? People hear that to the black. They're shocked. What if you brought a cow?